We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 58a. And the previous Summit, the Gemara brought a Braisa, which said that any item which some of it was brought onto the Mizbeach and offered and burned on the Mizbeach, and the remnant was not supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach, if that remnant, if it is burned on the Mizbeach, for example, the meat of Karbanos, which is not supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach, if that meat of the Karbanos is burned on the Mizbeach, that's a violation of a losase of Bal Taktiru, that cannot be burned on the Mizbeach. And on the previous Summit, the Gemara then brought a machlokas amoroim between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. What if instead of offering these items on the Mizbeach, instead they're offered on the kevesh, on the ramp of the Mizbeach? Would there still be liability in that situation? And Rabbi Yochanan says, chayiv, yes, there is liability in that case. And Rabbi Elazar says there's no liability in such a situation. And on the previous Summit, the Gemara brought a pasuk which serves as the source for Rabbi Yochanan, essentially an inclusion to include the ramp as well. And the Gemara in the previous Summit said that Rabbi Elazar, he learns from the word osam, that actually it's only by the items that are specifically listed in the pasuk, meaning So'or and Devash are listed in the pasuk, only by those items do we say that if one offers them on the ramp of the Mizbeach that is included, but the osam says it's only those items, but nothing else. And we will continue the Rashi from the previous Summit. What are those items that are mentioned in the pasuk? Again, it says So'or and Devash, but what is that referring to? Rashi on the previous Summit already said that the Shtei HaLechem is the So'or, that's the So'or, and so again, the Shtei HaLechem cannot be offered on the ramp of the Mizbeach. Ubikurim min Devash, and when it says Devash in the pasuk, that's a reference to Bikurim, that's the first fruits that are brought to the Beis HaMikdash, Tichsivi Ba'ukra, which are written in the pasuk. V'hachi Kamar, and this is what the pasuk is saying according to Rebbe Elazar, Karbon Reishis Takrivu Osam, Karbon Reishis, as Rashi will go on, these are referred to as Reishis. It says Takrivu Osam, that's the word Osam. Dahainu, and again, what does that refer to? That's Shtei HaLechem min HaSo'or, the Shtei HaLechem, that's from So'or, because So'or is mentioned in the pasuk just like Reishis. Tichsiv Chametz Te'afena, it's made from Chametz, it's made from So'or. V'Reishis Mikru, and the Shtei HaLechem is referred to as Reishis. Dehain Reishis L'chol HaMenachos Habos Mitvuas Shanazu, because that is the first of all the Menachos that are brought from the grain of this year. Tichsiv Ba Mincha Chadasha, that's what's written in the pasuk. It says Mincha Chadasha, the new Mincha. And Rashi continues, Uvikurim min hadvash, and the bikurim, that's from honey. That's what the word devash in the pasuk is referring to. V'ikru reishis, and that also is called reishis. Tichsiv reishis bikuri ad mascha. It says in the pasuk, reishis bikuri ad mascha hanachu deravinan lei kavesh k'mizbeach. And the point, according to Rebbe Elazar, is it's only by those items where we say the ramp is included like the mizbeach, and there's a violation of a negative commandment, bal taktiru. K'tichsiv v'al hamizbeach lo yalu, like it says in the pasuk, v'al hamizbeach lo yalu. And Rashi continues also from the previous Summit, it's only those items, but midi achrini, but all of the other items listed in the Braisa. Kagon, Besar Chatos, for example, the meat of carbon Chatos, V'chol Hanoch Deleel, all of those that were listed earlier in the Braisa on the previous Summit, De Asiri Mishum Kol Shemimenu Leishim, which again, there's a prohibition that if any of it was already burned on the Mizbeach, that was meant to be burned on the Mizbeach, the remainder then, there is a prohibition to burn that on the Mizbeach. So lo Ravinan Lach Kevesh K'Mizbeach, for those items, we do not include the ramp like the Mizbeach. And so the Gemara now continues and asks on Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with Osam? Rabbi Yochanan, hi Osam, my Avidle, what does Rabbi Yochanan do with the word Osam in the pasuk, which again Rabbi Elazar uses as an exclusion? And the Gemara continues, he needs it for what is taught in the following Braisa. The Braisa says, Yachol yehe yachid misnadev umevi kayotze ba nedavar. One might think that an individual is allowed to donate the Shtei HaLechem. The Shtei HaLechem is a communal carbon that's brought as an obligation on Shavuos. Can he decide to donate Shtei HaLechem? One might think he can. V'korei ani ba, motzes vasecha tishmor v'yasisa. And maybe I would refer to that as he has to keep his word. He makes a vow that he's going to bring it and he can donate it. One might think that that's a possibility. Talmud lomar karbon reishis takrivu. It says karbon reishis takrivu, which is in the plural, and therefore tzibor amarti lach velo yachid. Therefore, it's only a communal carbon, and it is not an individual carbon. Yachol lo yehe yachid mevi. Now, maybe only an individual can bring. She'eno mevi chovaso kayotze, because we don't find an obligation carbon of the individual like this. Avol yehe tzibor mevi, but maybe the community could donate a Shtei HaLechem. She'mevi chovaso kayotze, because there's a communal obligation of Shtei HaLechem, so maybe there can be a donated one as well. Talmud lomar, the pasuk says osam. It says osam. Them, that's an exclusion, and that says that tzibor is not able to donate a Shtei HaLechem, and so that is what Rabbi Yochanan does with the word osam. Uma yesh lach lahavi, and what is there to include? Shtei halechem min hasaor uvikurim min hadvash. That's shtei halechem. That's from saor. We're identifying now in the brayso of what these items are. When it says saor in the pasuk, it's the shtei halechem, and when it says dvash in the pasuk, bikurim is min hadvash. And Rashi explains, one might think that an individual can bring, he can donate and bring a shtei halechem, referring to the shtei halechem, da'allah koi, that's what we're going on, tichsiv karban reishis, like it's written in the pasuk, karban reishis, and so the Brisa said takrivu, it says takrivu in plural, mashma tzibor, that's understood as the community, and Rashi continues, aval yehei tzibor, maybe the tzibor is allowed to donate a shtei halechem, beis halechem nedava, they can donate shtei halechem, shaharei mevi'in shtei halechem chova, because they do bring shtei halechem as an obligation. Ve'echi dami nidvas tzibur, and what would be an example of nidvas tzibur? Kagon mimos shel shofroseim, that would be from the money of the shofaros. The shofaros is what contained the public funds. And then the Brisa says, Ma yesh lach lahavi. Now Rashi says, Lo garsinan la b'toras kohanim. This last line of the Brisa of Uma yesh lach lahavi, that does not appear in Toras Kohanim. Uman de garisle. Now if we do have that girsa, hachi kamer, this is what this line would be saying. Ma yesh lach lahavi mehan chova. Now what are we bringing as an obligation? To harashis chova mashma, because when it says rashis, it sounds like there's some kind of obligation to lo eshkechan carbon rashis. We don't find the carbon that's called rashis, so what are we referring to? And the Brisa again ends up saying that the shtei halechem, that's called rashis, that's from the saor, and the bikurim is from Devash, so when it says Devash, that also the Bikurim is called Rashis. That's what's referenced when the pasuk says Devash. And the Gemara continues and asks, Shtei halechem lo yikravu nedava, is it really true that the Shtei halechem cannot be brought as nedava, as donation? V'atanya, but didn't we learn in a Brisa, Im nemar kol saor, if it says in the pasuk kol saor, lama nemar kol Devash, why does it say kol Devash? V'im nemar kol Devash, and if it says in the pasuk kol Devash, lama nemar kol saor, why does it say kol saor? And the Brisa says, because there is by Sa'or something that is not true by Devash, and there's something by the Devash which is not true by Sa'or. And Rashi explains, Im nemar kol devash, if it says kol devash, l'rabos chatzi kometz, now that kol comes to include a half a kometz. Again, this is talking about the prohibition of offering it on the Mizbeach. Even a half a kometz is involved in that prohibition, kidim mefarish l'kamon, like will be explained later on. So if it says kol devash, lama nemar kol saor, why does it also have to say kol saor? Nigmar mi devash, we should just learn it from devash. Inami or, lo lichtov kol gabi devash, it doesn't have to write kol by devash, v'neilef mi saor, and we should learn it from Sa'or. And so again, the Brisa continued and said that there is by the Sa'or what is not by the Devash, and there is by the Devash what is not by the Sa'or. And the Brisa continues, Sa'or hutter michlalo b'mikdash. Sa'or is hutter michlalo b'mikdash. That means to say there is a permissibility, and we'll see as this goes on. And Devash lo hutter michlalo b'mikdash. By Devash we don't have that heter, we don't have that permissibility in some situations. And Devash hutter b'shiyari Menachos. Devash is mutter by the remainder, the remnant of a carbon mincha, but saor lo hutar b'shiyari menachos. But saor is not permitted b'shiyari menachos. And Rashi explains, saor hutar michlalo, saor is permitted kinim mefarish l'kamon. That's going to be explained as the Gemara goes on. And devash hutar b'shiyari menachos. Devash is mutter by the remainder of carbon mincha. What that means is as follows: Imrotza lolo shuletagen shiyari mincha b'devash. Let's say he has the remainder of the carbon mincha. He already took off the kometz. If he wants to knead and he wants to fry with honey that remainder to make it better quality, mutter, that is mutter. Dechol matanos kahuna ne'echolos begedula, because the manos kahuna, they're all eaten begedula, they're eaten in the most honorable fashion, in the greatest fashion, so to speak. Kedamrin and Perak Hazrav al chayayim, like we say in Perak Hazrav al chayayim lecha nesatim lemoshcha legedula. It's given to you for greatness. Kederech shahamalachim ochlet. It has to be eaten the way that kings eat. But saor lo hutter b'shiyari hamincha. That's not true by Sa'or. It's not permitted by the remainder of the Mincha. Kedamrin and La'el, like we said earlier, afilu chelkam, even their portion, lo seyafe chametz. It can't be baked as chametz. The point over here is Sa'or is leaven, and the halacha that a carbon mincha cannot be leaven, it cannot be chametz, that applies even by the remainder. So even though devash is mutter by shiyari menachos, that is not true by Sa'or. And so the Brisa continues and concludes, because there is this characteristic by Seor that doesn't exist by Devash, and there is by Devash a characteristic that doesn't exist by Seor. That's why Hutzrach Lomar Kol Seor, Hutzrach Lomar Kol Devash. The Pasuk needs to say Kol Seor, and it also needs to say Kol Devash. And the Gemara now continues and analyzes the Brisa. Seor de Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash. The characteristic by Seor was Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash. Now, what does that mean? My Nihu. What is that referring to? Isn't that referring to exactly what we're discussing above? Lav Shtei Halechem de Karva Nedava. Doesn't it mean to say that the Shtei Halechem are able to be offered as Nedava? That's what it means. Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash. Rashi explains, Lav Shtei Halechem de Karva Nedava b'Mizbeach. What it means is the Shtei Halechem can be offered on the Mizbeach as a Nedava, as a donation. De'imei Hanoch de Chova. Now, if you're talking about the Shtei Halechem, that is a Chova. Lo Matzi L'meimar. That you can't talk about that as being permitted on the Mizbeach. The Halo Hutter b'Mikdash, the Lo Karva L'Mizbeach. That's not Hutter b'Mikdash, because that's not offered on the Mizbeach. In other words, what the Gemara, what the Brisa is saying, or what the Gemara assumes that the Brisa is saying, is that when we say Seor is Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash, so Seor, as we said, is a reference to the Shtei Halechem. Now, the Shtei Halechem in general are not brought on the Mizbeach. So what are we talking about? Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash. The Gemara assumes that means that's brought up on the Mizbeach, and so therefore it must be it's referring to the Shtei Halechem which are offered as Nedava, that those in fact are offered on the Mizbeach, and that would show that there's such a thing as Shtei Halechem that's Nedava. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav Amram says, Lo likare v'mohen. No, we're talking about likare v'mohen. And Rashi here explains, likare v'mohen ashnei kivsei atzeres. We're going on the two sheep of Shavuos. Ka'amar, that's what the Bryce is saying. To karevim im shtei halechem, those are brought together with the shtei halechem. V'hainu hutru mechlal b'mikdash likare v'mohen. And what that means is since those are brought together with them, they're brought together with the shtei halechem, and they are offered on the Mizbeach, that's what it means. Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash. It's a reference to the Kivsei Atzeres. But the Gemara continues and asks, if that's the case, if that's called Hutter Michlalo b'Mikdash, when the sheep of Atzeres are brought on the Mizbeach, we can say the same thing for Bikurim. If so, Bikurim Nami, by Bikurim also. Again, the Devash is a reference to Bikurim, and it's saying that the Bikurim is not offered on the Mizbeach, but we can say it is Hutter Michlalo. There is an example of something that accompanies the Bikurim that is offered on the Mizbeach. Tetnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Meseches Bikurim, Hagozolos, the doves, Shalgave Hasalan, that were on the baskets. These were the baskets with the first fruits, with the Bikurim. So those doves, Hayuolos, they were brought as Karbonola, they were brought on the Mizbeach. Vahasalim Shabiyadim, and the baskets in their hands, Nitanim Lekohanim, those were given to the Kohanim. And so you see there is an accompanying carbon. There's a bird carbon that accompanies the Bikurim. But the Gemara says, no, Hanu La'atir Bikurim Hudasu, that was just to glorify the Bikurim. Literally, it is like a crown of the Bikurim, and that's what those birds are brought for, meaning they are not a requirement to come along with the Bikurim. It's just something that was brought as a crown to glorify the Bikurim. Rashi explains, Bikurim nami shayumivini moimofos. Again, there were birds that were brought together with the Bikurim. Vahasalim shabiyadan, and the baskets in their hands. Shel Bikurim shabiyad habaylim. Again, the baskets which had the Bikurim had the first fruits that were in the hands of the owners. Nitanim lekohanim, those are given to the Kohanim. And the Gemara continued and answered, La'ater Bikurim Maso, that's just like a crown for the Bikurim, Hanachofos, these birds, V'lav Chovaninu, they're not an obligation. And Rashi continues and notes, V'hadetnan b'Meseches Bikurim. Now that which we learned in the Mishnah in Meseches Bikurim, U'maisinan b'lulav ha'arav, and it's brought in Meseches Sukkah, in Perek Lulav ha'arav, it says, HaBikurim te'unin karban v'shiru bracha v'lina. It says Bikurim do require a karban. Amrinan b'Talmud Yerushalmi, we say in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the high karban shlamimhu, we say that this is referring to a karban shlamim, Ksiv hacha v'samachta b'cholatov, because it's written over here v'samachta b'cholatov. U'ksiv hasam v'zavachta shlamim v'yachalta sham v'samachta. It says by shlamim v'samachta, so we know it's a shlamim, and so therefore it seems there is a carbon that has to accompany the bikurim. But Rashi says v'lav kravim imoyin chashavlu. That's not really called being brought together with them. Why? Shelo hayu zakuk and zelozeh, because they really weren't required for one another. Lavo yachad l'mikdash. They didn't have to come together to the Beis Hamikdash. Elachova olav lahavi shlamim. It just was a general obligation upon the individual to bring a shlamim there. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rami Bar Chama me Rav Chisda. Rami Bar Chama asked Rav Chisda the following question: Hamalam ipsar chatas ha'of al gave hamizbeach ma'u. If somebody offers from the meat of a chatas ha'of, a bird carbon chatas on the mizbeach, what's the halacha over there? Now, what's unique about a chatas ha'of is that the blood is applied to the mizbeach, and then the entire thing is eaten by the kohanim. None of it is burned on the mizbeach, and so maybe we would say as follows: Kol shemimenu liishim amar achmona. Only if some of it was burned on the mizbeach, then there's a prohibition to offer the rest on the mizbeach, because v'hai ein mimenu liishim. But in this case, there's none of it that's burned on the mizbeach. Again, the chatas ha'of is none of it is burned on the mizbeach. It's all eaten by the kohanim, and so therefore maybe if some of it was burned on the mizbeach, that's not a violation. O dilmar, maybe kol sheshmo carbon, anything that's called a carbon, the violation would apply. V'hainami shmo carbon, and this also it's called a carbon, and therefore the violation applies. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lei, he said back to him, Rav Chisda responded, Kol sheshmo carbon, anything that's called a carbon, v'hainami shmo carbon, and this also is called a carbon, and therefore the violation does apply. Rashi explains, Kol sheshmo carbon, Amar achmona delo yaktir misharav. The Torah says anything that's called a carbon, one cannot burn the remnant on the mizbeach. Dahachi ksiv basar dahukra carbon rashis, because that's written right after this pasuk of carbon rashis. Umikra nidrash lafanav. It says carbon rashis right after. We can darshan the pasuk before it, and so therefore again anything that is referred to as a carbon is going to be involved in this prohibition. And of shvo carbon, the bird is called a carbon. Tichsiv vim min ha'of ola carbono. It says vim min ha'of ola carbono. It is referred to as a carbon. And in terms of the psukim that Rashi is quoting, again the two psukim are as follows. The later pasuk is actually this pasuk, carbon rachis takrivo osam lashem. That's where it says carbon. And then the earlier pasuk is where there's the prohibition, kol mincha asher takrivu lashem lo seyasa chametz ki chol seor v'chol devash lo saktiru mimenu isha lashem. That's the pasuk of lo saktiru, that you can't burn it on the mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Ketanoi, this issue is actually machlokas tanoim in the following brisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol shemimenu leishim, anything that from it is burned on the fires, that's where the prohibition exists. Rabbi Akiva says, Kol sheshmo carbon, anything that's called a carbon. Again, that's what Rav Chisda said above. Anything that's called a carbon, the prohibition is going to apply. My beinayu, what's the difference between them? Exactly what we just said above. Amar Rav Chisda says, Besar chatas ha'of yika beinayu. The difference is the meat of the chatas ha'of. It's not mimenu leishim. There's no part of it that's supposed to be burned on the mizbeach, but on the other hand, it is called a carbon. And the Gemara continues with another approach to understanding the nafkamina, the practical difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rav says, Log shemen shel mitzora ika beinayu. The difference between them is the log shemen, the log of oil of the mitzora. Again, that is something that's not mimenu leishim, but on the other hand, it is referred to as a carbon. Tatani Levi, because Levi taught kol karbonim, it says kol karbonim l'rabos log shemen shel mitzora. That comes to include the log shemen shel mitzora. Rashi explains, log shemen shel mitzora ein mimenu leishim, none of it is burned on the fires. Aval carbon ikri, but it is referred to as a carbon. Kedamrinan be'elu menachos, we say that in elu menachos, lechol karbonim l'rabos log shemen shel mitzora. Lechol karbonim includes the log shemen shel mitzora, v'gufei namiksiv, and even in the pasuk itself it says, v'hikriv oso li asham v'es log hashamin. It says it's offered as an asham v'es log hashamin, and so again, it's referred to as a carbon. V'kasha, now if you're going to ask, harei karav mimenu, there is something offered from it to the fires, the asham mitzora bo'imo leishim, because the asham mitzora comes, and that goes on the fires of the mizbeach, kishtei halechem mishum kvasim, and that would be no different than the shtei halechem, because we say that's also mimenu leishim, because of the kvasim, parts of the sheep are burned on the mizbeach. But Rashi says to that halo kasha, that's not difficult. The asham lo shayich bahadei lug legamri, the asham is not completely connected to the log shaman. The adam mevi asham achshav, because a person is able to bring his asham now, the logo ad asar yamim, and the log shaman can be another 10 days from now, keda amron b'hakometz zuta, like we say earlier in hakometz zuta. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brisa, Sa'or Bal Taktiru. Again, the pasuk says Sa'or leaven is not allowed to be burned on the Mizbeach. Now, Ainli Alakulo, I only know the entire Sa'or is not allowed to be burned on the Mizbeach. What about Miksaso Minayan? From where do we know even part of it there's a prohibition? And the Gemara will explain what exactly part of it means. Talmud Lomar Kol, the pasuk says Kol. It doesn't simply say Sa'or, it says Kol Sa'or, and this was quoted earlier in the Amud, and therefore Kol tells us it applies even to Miksaso. also even to a smaller amount. A ruvo minayin, what if there's a mixture? From where do we know that the prohibition applies to a mixture? That would be a mixture of chametz and non-chametz, a mixture of seor and non-seor. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says kikol, it says kikol, and that says even a mixture. And the Gemara now asks, my kamar, what exactly is this brisa saying? What does it mean miksaso? What does it mean part of it? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Bryce is saying, Seor Bal Taktiru, again, one cannot burn Seor on the Mizbeach, Ein Li Ela Kazayis, now I only know a Kazayis, Chatzi Zayis Minayin, from where do we know that a half a Zayis of Seor is not allowed to be burned on the Mizbeach? Talmud Lomar Kol, it says Kol, and a Ruvo Minayin, how do we know a mixture also is prohibited? Talmud Lomar Ki Kol, the Pasuk says Ki Kol, and so essentially Abaya is understanding that without the word Kol, it would have to be a Kazayis, and with the word Kol, even a Chatzi Zayis. And the Gemara continues with another approach. Rava Amar, Rava says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Bryce is saying. So Or Bal Taktiru, one is not allowed to burn leaven. Ein Li Ela Kometz, I only know a kometz of Seor, a fistful of Seor. Chatzi Kometz Minayin, how do we know it applies even to a half a kometz? So instead of a half a Zayis, Rava learns a half a kometz. Talmud Lomar Kol, the Pasuk says Kol. A Ruvo Minayin, how do we know it applies to a mixture? Talmud Lomar Ki Kol, the Pasuk says Ki Kol. And the Gemara continues and explains, what exactly is the machlokas between Abaya and Rava? Why does Abaya say half a Zayis and Rava says half a kometz? And the Gemara explains, Abaya Savar, Abaya holds, Yesh kometz, pachos mishnei zaysim. You can have a kometz that is actually less than 2 zaysim, and so therefore it would emerge if a kometz can be so small. So therefore, if we're going to take half of that amount, it actually is going to end up being a half a Zayis according to Abaya. Rashi explains, my ka'amar, what is this saying? My shiure, the kamar kula miksaso. What is the shear that we're talking about? The entirety of the shear, and then part of the shear. It's going to be half the shear. And again, chatzi zayis. So according to Abaya, it is a chatzi zayis. It is a half an olive. Uchegon deisei be'ene. That would be if it's not in a mixture, if it's right in front of us. And eruvo means she'ervu and matzah. You mix the chametz with matzah, the lo minkar, that it's not recognizable. And what's the difference between Abaya and Rava? Abaya savar yesh kometz pachos mishnei zaysim. Abaya holds in general there's such a thing as a kometz less than 2 zaysim. Velo saktiru lekometz shalei mashma, and therefore when it says lo saktiru, that would mean an entire kometz. V'kevan diyesh kometz pachos mishnei zaysim. Now once a kometz is less than 2 zaysim, so ashminan kol yisera, then it would emerge that the extra kol, what is that teaching us? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Ches Amud Beis.